Yes, now, hello. Okay, so thank you, Siddhi. Uh, in the last lecture, we are dealing with particularly Victorian age. The focus is on poetry, and in the last lecture, we talked about. Let me share a PPT with you. One of the important poet, and in fact, the age is known after his name, that is Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now, Tennyson is one of the poet. You can see that he is a mixture of Robert Browning and Matthew Arnold. Browning is a poet of hope, and on the other side, you have Matthew Arnold, who is a pessimistic poet who particularly a religious person, and his poems shows the influence of Darwin on Victorian period. Now, in this lecture, the focus is the other two poets, important poets. There are other few poets who are writing in Victorian age, but you have another prominent name, that is Robert Browning. Now, Browning is one of the poet who was born in 1812 and died in 1889. The lifespan is important because he is one of the prominent name of this period. In fact, there is a debate that whether this age should be known as age of Browning, or you can say the age of Dickens, because Dickens is also one of the prominent name in this period who is writing in prose. So the important thing is that you have another poet after Tennyson, and this is a poet who uh, was largely educated at home, and at the age he particularly studied in a London university, but later on he returned home after a brief period. He did not complete uh, his education, and in early age he wrote some sonnets and some poems, and he was highly influenced by P.B. Shelley, one of the revolutionary poet of, you can say, romantic age, who is famous for his odes and the necessity of atheism. That is one of the revolutionary work we discussed when we talked about the romantic age. In the initial period, you can say that he was highly influenced by Wordsworth. Later on, you know that he is the writer who wrote a poem called The Lost Leader. I mentioned that when I taught you William Wordsworth. Why he called Wordsworth as a lost leader? The reason is that Wordsworth accepted the poet laureateship, and he, as a poet laureate, he is not going to criticize the government, and that is the reason that you can say that the influence, yeah, yeah, that is the reason that because of this, you can say, a disappointment, he wrote the poem called The Lost Leader. Now, in the initial period, he wrote one work, that is in 1833, Pauline, a fragment of confession. Not important title, just remember the title. You can see the image of this poet. This is Robert Browning, one of the handsome person of his age, and of course, one of the writer who is famous for starting dramatic monologue in English literature. Of course, you have Tennyson who wrote some poems in dramatic monologue, but this form was particularly famous by this writer, uh, popularized by this writer Robert Browning. Dramatic monologue, you can say that is one of the thing which is a monologue. Mono means one, and log means you have conversation. So it is presented in a dramatic form. That is why it is known as a dramatic monologue. Then in the next poem, he talked about one Swiss alchemist, Paracelsus. That is the name of the poem. Again, not important. One of the title which is very important, that is after his visit, and he wrote one poem that is Sordello. This is one of the important title. Okay, and this is particularly focused on the development of soul. That is the theme of this poem, and in fact this poem was influenced by Dante. Dante is famous for his great one book that is an epic, the Divine Comedy. Okay, so that is you can say Sordello deals with this theme because this is a poem which was written after his visit of Italy. And you know that in Italian literature, Dante is one of the prominent name. After this period, you have Pauline, which has you can say earlier work, and this is published anonymously, long poem, and you can see the clear influence of P.B. Shelley in his writing. But you can see that this is one of the poem which got an critical remark from one of the writer, John Stuart Mill, where he says that this is a poem where you can find a more intense and morbid self-consciousness than I never knew in any sane human being. This is his reaction after reading this collection that is known as Pauline, and the subtitle of the poem is A Fragment of a Confession. Then you have Sordello. Remember that it is written in heroic couplet. The influence is clearly that is visible in this poem is Divine Comedy of Dante. Now we have these some poems. We have some poems which is considered as the masterpiece, and most of the poems deals with the you can say titles which are taken from Bible, and he wrote some collections. One is Pipa Passes, that is published in 1841, and another famous collection is Dramatic Lyrics, 1842. Then you have Romance and Lyrics, that is 1845, where you can find some plays also, but he is not famous for his plays. Of course, he is famous as a poet, poet of dramatic monologue. And these are the examples of his dramatic monologue. For Fierce Lover, one of the psychological poem where particularly the hero who killed one of the lady, that is Porphia. My Last Duchess, a very famous poem. Then the Pied Piper of Hamelin. You might have studied this poem in your Hindi syllabus when you are in standard 5 or 6. Then how they brought the good news from Ghent to Aix, home thoughts from abroad. The bishop ordered his tomb in St. Prax's church, the flight of the Duchess. These are the important titles of his dramatic monologues. Now, let us see some important works which are generally prescribed in the syllabus. As I've told you, Pipa Pasi, that is one of the important poem. Now, in the concluding line, this is a very small poem, in fact, 8 or you can say 10 lines, and this is the line which is completely opposite to the ending line of Thomas Hardy's. taste of the urban village. This is asked in the exam. God is in his heaven, all is right with the world. So you can find the elements of hope in his poetry. He says that God is in his heaven and all is right with the world. મતલબ દુનિયા જે છે એમાં બધું સારી રીતે ચાલી રહ્યું છે અને ભગવાન જે છે સ્વર્ગમાં બેઠા છે. That is completely opposite to Hardy's case, where you Hardy says that God is not in his heaven and everything is wrong with the world. Okay, and Hardy is another writer who is a pessimist writer. Okay, so that is why I've told you that Browning is considered the poet of hope. Then you have, remember this line, Pippa passes. This is very important. Then you have another poetess of this period, that is Elizabeth Barret. And Elizabeth was 6 years elder than the poet called Robert Browning. And what happens that they fell in love and secretly married her, and they eloped to Italy. Browning settled in Florence where their son was born, and they lived there until Elizabeth's death in 1861. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, that is the wife of Robert Browning. And that is why that most of the period of Browning's life is spent in Italy. And in fact, Sordello is also a poem which is written after his visit of Italy. Now, most of the poems deals with the Italic themes and even the titles. You know that Italy is the center of Renaissance in the earlier period, and you have some painters. So that is visible in the poems of their influence is clearly visible in the poems of Robert Browning. Okay, you will see some poems like My Last Touches and Rabbi Ben Ezra. Then you have one of the long poem that is you can say you have I yes, one poem, Rabbi Ben Ezra, and yeah, Mr. Sludge, the medium. These are the long poems. And Pralipolipi, that is one of the important poem, again a long poem, where you can find the influence of Italian. Now, what happens that there is a group of poets which we are going to study in this period, that is PRB movement, Free Rapid Brotherhood. Just a minute. Yeah. So in 1850, he published one collection, that is Christmas Eve and Easter Days. And this was, you can say, turning period in his career. In fact, he got attention when he married to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, because Elizabeth Barrett Browning is also one of the famous poetess of this period. And she is known for her sonnets, which are addressed to Robert Browning. So this is the period where you have so many poems published, and it got the public's attention. And the title includes Pralipolipi, a Tocacto of Galupsi, Child Roland to the Dark Tower came, Bishop Blogram's Apology, Andrea del Sarto, Love Among the Ruins, Saul, Cleon, One World More to EBB, that is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Then you have some dramatic personas, that is another collection where you have James Lee Vibe about Wagler, Prospis, Rabbi Ben Ezra, A Death in the Desert, Mr. Sludge, The Medium, and the famous poem that is Caliban upon satyrs, which are published during this period. Now, important thing is that he is a writer of so many poems. Now, Pralipolipi, that is based on one of the Florentine painter and monk who was being interrogated by some Medici watchmen who have caught him out at night. A very long poem, but very interesting poem. Then, as I told you, that you have another painter, Renaissance painter in Florence, Andrea del Sarto, taking to his nagging wife Lucrezia. This is also one of the important poem, and the title is Caliban upon Satyrs. It is very difficult to describe each and every poem in a detail because you have so much, you can say, amount of works written by this writer. And in fact, in a Victorian age, you will study so many writers like Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, then you have William Makepeace Thackeray. These are the writers who wrote so many things, so many works when it comes to poetry or when it comes to novels. Uh, one of the poem that is generally prescribed in the syllabus is Pralipolipi, Orpheus Lover, Rabbi Ben Ezra, My Last Touches. Then you have some Pipa passes that is generally prescribed in the syllabus of BA. So remember these titles and at least try to go with particularly these titles and try to remember some important lines, not all the lines, but some important lines from these poems. For example, you have Rabbi Ben Ezra, where you have the first line, grow old along with me, the best is yet to be. One of the favorite line of me, mine, that is the best is yet to be. And this is the opening lines of Rabbi Ben Ezra that is asked in the exam. Then you have, you can say that the other influence is that about Wagner, that is based on one of the German music composer. Then you have the bishop orders his tomb at St. Prax's Church. Again, the theme is taken from a Renaissance bishop. Then my last touches, that is very famous poem generally prescribed in the syllabus of BA, where there is one of the widowed Duke of Ferrara who is showing the picture of his duchies, but later on we come to know about the truth that the last duchess was killed by the Duke himself. Then the grammarian's funeral, one of the important poems, home thoughts from abroad. In fact, what happens that a homesick traveler longs for every detail of his beloved home. This is particularly written when he was living in Italy and he is missing his homeland, England. Orpheus Lover, as I've told you, again a poem which is generally prescribed in the syllabus of BA, where one of the character who kills his beautiful lover without any reasons. And again, this poem is very important. Some lines has been asked in the exams from this poem that God has said nothing. That is exactly what he says that I stuck and I focused on her, and God has said nothing. After killing the lover, જે છે એ beloved જે છે એના માર્યા પછી લવર જે છે એની સામે જોઈ રહે છે અને એ કહે છે કે ભગવાન પણ આમ જ સામે કંઈ બોલ્યા નથી. Very strange poem. In fact, in the initial period, he praises the beauty of Porphia, and somehow later on, he killed the lover. Then you have the ring and the book. This is, you can say, one of the important poem in his career, and this is a long poem which contains more than 500 lines. And you can say that because of this poem, he become very popular. And in fact, what happens that when he was living in Italy, Browning had discovered in a stall an old yellow book. Now, this is related to necromancy. એક પીળા કલરની જે છે બુક મળે છે એમને, અને where he can particularly get an idea of necromancy, અને એના ઉપર જે છે ઇન્સ્પિરેશન લઈને અમને આ બુક લખી છે, જે છે The Ring and the Book, very long poem, generally considered as little epics. Then you have some works where you have particularly can say that one of the title is Asolando, Fancies and Facts, which was published in the last year of his life, 1889. And he tried to write some plays, and he wrote one play that is the translation of Aeschylus Agamemnon. That is very important. Remember this title, Aeschylus Agamemnon. We have already particularly discussed Agamemnon in a Greco-Roman period, but this is asked in the exam because he is not a famous as a dramatist, but he translated one of the one of the drama, that is Aeschylus Agamemnon. He died in 1889. He was buried in Florence. Uh, but what happens that he wished to be buried in Florence, but that was not possible. His body was returned to England and buried in Westminster Abbey, that is known as Poets Corner. ઇવન જ્યારે એમનું મૃત્યુ થયું ત્યારે ગ્રીક છે એ પણ જે છે એ તૈયાર હતા કે અમે લોકો જે છે બોડી એમને આપી દો, અમે જે છે એમને અહીંયા દફનાવીશું. બટ somehow he wanted to be buried in Florence, જે જગ્યાએ એમને સેટલ થયા હતા અને એમની જગ્યા એમની ઈચ્છા હતી કે આ રીતે થાય, but that was not possible at that time. So he was buried at Westminster Abbey. Browning is a poet where you can see that sometimes that he is based when he is writing particularly dramatologue, and in a dramatic monologue you have some kind of the elements of music. You can feel the variety of metrical forms, and he is master in manipulating rhythmic effects in his work. And you can see that you can find the turn in his poetry, where, as for example, in Porphyria's Lover, My Last Touch is, and Pipa passes, suddenly the mood of the poem uh, is changed uh, when you are reading a particular poem of Browning. Remember that. Another thing is that Elizabeth Barrett Browning, uh, જે છે એમની વાઇફ છે, and he is one of the eldest children out of 12 children, and he suffered some serious problems, illness, and epilepsy જે છે એ problem હતો. And like Coleridge, she used to take opium જે છે એ લેતા હતા, બરાબર. He was she was uh, having a command in Latin and Greek, and she is one of the celebrated poet of her period, જે છે, because this is the picture of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And what happens that earlier she tried to translate Aeschylus from Matthew's Bound, then she disliked the first edition. That is why she decided to revise the earlier edition. Then in 1835, her family moved to London, and here uh, she came into contact with some important names of this period, and That is how you can say that she got some interest in literature. Earlier collection, that is Seraphine and Other Poems, which was published in 1838. Then what happens? She suffered a relapse when two of her brothers died, and later on, what happens that the important year, that is 1844, where you have a drama of exile and Lady Geraldine's courtship. These are the two works which you can say are famous during this period. And then, in fact, after reading this work, Lady Geraldine, Robert Browning admired her work, and from this work, they started to write letters to each other. And these relations, correspondence, you can say, developed in a relationship, and they fall in love, and later they married. જે છે વોટ હેપન્સ કે ફ્લોરેન્સમાં રહ્યા ત્યારે મેં તમને કીધું કે જે છે સન એમનો રોબર્ટ જે છે ત્યાં જ જન્મ્યો હતો અને આપણે જે છે એમને યાદ રાખીએ છીએ because of her collection, that is sonnets addressed to રોબર્ટ બ્રાઉની. એ જે છે આપણા માટે મહત્વનું છે. એના સિવાય તમારી જોડે એક વર્ક છે પોએમ્સ બિફોર કોંગ્રેસ, દેટ વોઝ પબ્લિશ્ડ ઇન 1860. અને તમારી જોડે જે સૌથી વધારે નેટ અને જીસેટમાં પ્રશ્ન પૂછે છે દેટ ઇઝ ધીસ ટાઇટલ સોનેટ્સ ફ્રોમ ધ પોર્ટુગીઝ which was published in 1850, and it contains 44 love sonnets. Remember the number because it is asked in the exam. Okay, how many sonnets are there in the collection called Sonnets from the Portuguese? The publication year is also asked. તો આ જે છે તમારે ફેમસ સોનેટ્સ છે જે એમના હસબન્ડને એડ્રેસ થયેલી છે. ઇનફેક્ટ she never want to publish these poems because these are the sonnets which describe the love between Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. જે છે એમનો લવ જે છે એ બતાવે છે, એટલા માટે એ નતા ઈચ્છતા કે આ જે છે પબ્લિક લાઈફમાં આવે. But Robert Browning inspired her to publish these poems, and this was published in 1850 after the 4 years of her marriage with Browning. Then, what is one of the poem that is Browning જે છે એ પોતે જે છે એલિઝાબેથ પેરેટ બ્રાઉનિંગ એમને આ જે પોએમ્સ છે એમાં પોતાની જાતને માય લિટલ પોર્ટુગીઝ એમ એડ્રેસ કર્યું છે. That is also important. And generally, one sonnet is prescribed in the syllabus. How do I love thee? Let me count the way. Let me count the way. That is a poem which talks about the love story. As you know, that sonnets are generally addressed to lover or beloved. And in this case, Browning was the subject matter. So the title itself suggests the theme, How Do I Love Thee? Let me count the ways. This is a sonnet which is generally prescribed in the syllabus of MA University, or sometimes in the syllabus of BA in some university. Then what happens that you have Aurora Leigh, that is one of the epic, and she in fact called this work as epic verse novel, and it is written in blank verse, which contains 9 books, but not famous from net point of view. Uh, you have to remember the title, that is Sonnets from the Portuguese. That is one of the important collection, and she died in 1861, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Another poet of this period is Matthew Arnold. In fact, Arnold is one of the representative poet of this period, and in fact, he is famous for his poems, and in fact, he was a professor of poetry at Oxford University. So he used to deliver some lectures in a university, and later on his lectures are published as a book. Uh, and most of the books, or you can say essays, uh, are related to criticism. One of the important prominent name, one of the important texts in the field of cultural study is Culture and Anarchy, where you can find the role of culture, why culture is important, what is the concept of culture. This is discussed by the writer for the first time systematically in English literature, that is Matthew Arnold. Again, very important poet, that is why lifespan is asked in the exam, 1822 to 1888, that is his lifespan. And you can find that particularly he was a son of headmaster. His father was Thomas Arnold, who was a inspector of a rugby school. And Arnold, in fact, wrote one poem that is considered as an elegy written uh, to his father, that is Rugby Chapel. Rugby Chapel. Remember this? This is asked in the exam because he wrote so many elegies, and one of the elegies is addressed to his father. Then you have particularly most of the works are influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. He was a staunch religious person who believed in the religion, and after the publication of Origin of Species written by Darwin, that completely uh, you can say change the mood of the nation, where you can find the conflict between science and religion, and that is reflected in the works of Arnold. In fact, one of the prominent poem of this period is Dover Witch, which reflects the mood of the nation or the mood of the people who believed in the religion. Let us see the picture of Matthew Arnold. This is a picture of Matthew Arnold. Uh, another thing is that he wrote some works. You have the collection that is the Strayed Reveller and Other Poems that was published in 1849. Then you have another collection that is known as New Poems, 1867, and this is one of the important period in his life. You have some major works, other works where you have poems, another collection of poems, 1853, poems, that is the second series, 1855, one tragedy that is asked in the NET exam, Marop. This is a classical tragedy, not important, but somehow, as I've told you, this is a trend. We have find in the exam that sometimes the poets, prominent poets, uh, drama have been uh, asked by the examiners. જેમ કે વર્ડસવર્થ છે તો બોર્ડર જે છે એમનું પ્લે છે પૂછાયેલું છે. તમારી જોડે બેન જોન્સન છે તો એ કોમેડીમાં ફેમસ છે, બટ એક ટ્રેજેડી છે સજાના એન્ડ હિઝ ફોલ, એ પૂછાયેલું છે. એસટી કોલરીજનો પણ પ્લે છે એ પૂછાયેલું છે. પીબી શૈલીના છે પ્લે પૂછાયેલા છે. તો એના કારણે જે છે મેરોપ જે છે ટાઇટલ ઇમ્પોર્ટન્ટ બની રહે છે, ડીપમાં જવાની તમારે જરૂર નથી. Uh, these are the collections of his poems. Then you have some poetic plays where you have Empedocles on Etna. That is another title, not important. Tristram and Iseult, Sohrab and Rustam. These are the two narrative poems. Sohrab and Rustam is generally prescribed in some of the universities. There are three elegies written by him. One is Tiresias. Tiresias is particularly written on the death of Arthur Hugh Clough, one of the poet of Victorian period. Scholar Gypsy, and Rugby Chapel. These are the two poems which are elegy written on the death of his father, and you have another elegy that is memorial verses. Then you have some lyrics where you have Scholar Gypsy, Philomela, Margaret poems, the Forsaken Merman, and the most important out of this is Dover Beach. Now, Dover Beach is generally prescribed in the syllabus of BA or MA of every university because this is the poem which you can say summarize the Victorian age. Now, in fact, this poem is addressed to his wife, where Dover Beach is one of the place where you can find the place is between France and England, and the name of the beach is Dover. They went to visit this, and the poet was sitting near the window, and uh, he was particularly watching the sea, and that is how this poem came into existence. તમારી જોડે જે છે ફેમસ લાઈન છે પોએમની પૂછાયેલી છે જે પહેલી જ લાઈન છે that the sea is full of moon જે છે એ તમારે લાઈન પૂછાયેલી છે એના સિવાય તમારી જોડે એક અંદરની જે ડીપ લાઈન છે એ જે છે કે where here you have the sea of faith was once full and lay around the earth like curdle. Then he says that, and we are here as on a darkling plain, set with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Ignorant armies means the unknown enemy, and that is science. You have conflict between science and religion in this period, and that is reflected in this poem. The sea is full at tonight. That is the opening line, exact line. The sea is full at tonight. Then another thing is that you have mention of Sophocles and other Greek writers. And this is a poem which talks about the influence of Darwin on a Victorian people. You know that after the theory of evolution, people started to question the authority of God. You know, earlier you have theocentric world where God is at the center, but after the Darwin theory of evolution and his certain ideas particularly talks about that we are not a special creation of God. So it leads to some kind of confusion in the mind of the people. The scholars they started to think and they started to questioning the god, and that is how this mood is reflected in the poem called Dover Beach. This is a very important poem, and you have to particularly it contains 37 lines only. You have to read this poem, which is available on Poetry Foundation, and you have to remember some important lines, opening lines, and another lines which is asked in the exam is that where ignorant armies clash by night. So remember, go on a Poetry Foundation and read this poem. Tiresias is an pastoral elegy that is written on the Arnold's friend, that is poet Arthur Clough, who was who particularly died in 1861. Then you have particularly, you can say, the influence of Virgil's Eclose, and you have some characters who are presented as shepherd, and that is why this is a pastoral elegy. Scholar Gypsy, again a pastoral elegy, that is particularly જે છે એ એમના ફાધર જે છે એમના જે છે પર લખેલી છે મોત ઉપર બરાબર. And this is a companion poem of Thyrsis. Thyrsis જે છે એ એમના ફાધર થોમસ આર્નોલ્ડ પર લખેલી છે એની કમ્પેનિયન પોએમ છે મીન્સ યુ હેવ ટુ સ્ટડી ધીસ ટુ પોએમ્સ ટુગેધર ઇન ઓર્ડર ટુ ગેટ ધી કમ્પ્લીટ મેસેજ ઓફ ધી પોએમ. તો થાઇરેસિયસ જે છે એની કમ્પેનિયન એટલે કે એની જે સિક્વલ જે પોએમ કહી શકાય એ જે છે સ્કોલર જીપ્સી. સો it is asked in exam that which are the two elegies written on the death of his father, that is scholar gypsy. બરાબર. અને બીજું છે થાઇરેસિયસ. Another dramatic poem that is Empedocles on Etna. Just remember the title and the publication years 1852. Another poet, we are particularly studying this module from the poetic point of view, means we are only discussing Arnold as a poet. We are not talking about his critical works and his role as a cultural critic. We will deal with that when we will deal with criticism. Another poet who is a minor poet of this period is Arthur Hugh Clough, and the lifespan is 1890 to 1861. 61 is important because this is the year he died, and that is how Arnold wrote the poem called particularly જે છે એલિજી લખી હતી થાઇરેસિયસ એ જે છે તમારે ધ્યાનમાં રાખવાની છે. In fact, this poet is famous for two works, the bothy of particularly Toberna Vuluchi, that means a long vacation pastoral. Okay, and આ જે છે ફક્ત તમારે ફેમસ છે એટલા માટે કે આર્નોલ્ડે આમના પર એલિજી લખેલી છે. માઇનર પોએટ ઓફ ધીસ પીરિયડ. Then you have, this is a period where you have some American writers who are particularly writing in this period, that is Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Wordsworth Longfellow, one of the important name, Edgar Allan Poe, Henry David Thoreau, who was a student of Emerson, Walt Whitman, Herman Melville. In fact, Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, then particularly Emily Dickinson. These are the poets who were influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson. You have Herman Melville, who is influenced by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So these are the poets which we will discuss when we will talk about American literature. But just remember that these are the poets who are the contemporaries of these Victorian writers. Okay. In fact, these are the poets. For example, you have Ralph Waldo Emerson, who visited England and he met Wordsworth, he met Coleridge, he met. You have this poet who is his close friend, that is Thomas Carlyle. So that influence is reflected in some of the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Then you have one important movement of this period, that is PRB. In PRB, what happens that you have PRB means Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, that is shortly known as PRB. You have some writers who are poets as well as painters like William Blake. So in this group you have D.G. Rossetti, William Hunt, then you have John Milius. These are the three important names. Then you have other important names like C.G. Rossetti, who is a sister of D.G. Rossetti. And these are the writers who were highly influenced by John Ruskin. John Ruskin is another important name who particularly contributed in the field of prose during this period. And in fact, he was a professor of architecture. He is famous for one work, that is Unto This Last. Unto This Last is particularly translated by Mahatma Gandhi, where you have four essays in that work. So these poets are influenced by John Ruskin, and they have particularly revolted against so-called realism of this period where you have find the influence of Royal Academy. And what happens that these are the painters, so they are the writers who were influenced by Italian Renaissance poets like Raphael, Michelangelo were the model for these painters as well as poets, which is known as PRB movement in literature, English literature. You have another name which is very famous name, that is William Morris. And from this you can say you have the beginning of one debate, that is art for art's sake and art for morality sake. That is the movement which is known as aestheticism in English literature. You have some writers like Oscar Wilde, William Morris, D.G. Rossetti, who particularly believe in art for art's sake. Art for art's sake means that the only aim of art is to providing the pleasure, joy, to have on the sublimity, or you can say sublime joy. That is the only function of literature according to this group, or you can say followers of aesthetic movement. On the other side, you have some writer who believed in art for morality's sake, where for example you have John Ruskin, that Thomas Carlyle, then later on you have G.B. Shaw, Tolstoy, Gandhi. In the American literature, you can talk about Emerson. Those who believe that the aim of literature is to reform the society, and literature should give a moral message at the end of a particular work. So in this period, you have two groups. One is believed in art for art's sake, and other group that is particularly art for morality, or sometimes it is known as art for God's sake. So these are the other members who are famous. Among these, Christiana Rossetti, that is the sister of D.G. Rossetti, the lifespan is 1832-1894. William M. Rossetti, brother of D.G. Rossetti and Christiana Rossetti. One of the important name is A.C. Swinburne. And you have other names, minor names like F.G. Stephens, James Collison, Thomas Woolner, Coventry Petmore. તમને જનરલી છે ડીજી રોસોટી, સીજી રોસોટી, વિલિયમ મોરિસ અને એસી સ્વિનબર્ગ છે, આના ગ્રુપમાં નામ આપેલા હોય છે અને આના આધારે મુવમેન્ટ ઓળખવાનું કહેવામાં આવે છે. દેટ ઇઝ particularly PRB, Pre Raphaelite Brotherhood movements. Then what happens that જે છે એમને એક જનરલ પબ્લિશ કર્યું હતું. આ મુવમેન્ટ છે એટલી બધી ચાલી નહીં. જનરલ છે એ ફક્ત 3 વર્ષ સુધી ચાલ્યું, અને મુવમેન્ટ પણ છે એ કહી શકાય કે 5-6 વર્ષ સુધી ચાલ્યું. અને જનરલનું નામ તમને એક્ઝામમાં પૂછાય છે, નેટ અને જીસેટ બંનેમાં. તો જર્મ, that is the name of the journal, or you can say periodical, started by these writers, that is the germ, GERM. આમને જે છે પર્ટિક્યુલરલી એક ટાઇટલ પણ જે છે કે એસે પબ્લિશ કર્યો હતો, જેનું નામ છે ધ ફ્લેસી સ્કૂલ ઓફ પોએટ્રી. એક રાઇટર જે છે, ઓથર રોબર્ટ બુચાનન, જે છે પીઆરબી મુવમેન્ટના રોઝોટી, મોરિસ અને એસી સ્વિનબર્ગ એમની જે છે થીમ ઉપર જે છે પર્ટિક્યુલરલી જે ફ્રેન્ક ટ્રીટમેન્ટ જે છે સેક્સ્યુઆલિટીની એના ઉપર ક્રિટિસાઇઝ કરતો એક એસે લખેલો છે. તો આ તમને પૂછાયેલો છે. ધ ફ્લેસી સ્કૂલ ઓફ પોએટ્રી ઇઝ રિટન બાય, રિમેમ્બર ધ નેમ, રોબર્ટ બુચાનન. And what happens? Rossotti means DG Rossotti replied with the title called The Stealthy School of Criticism in 1871. And in fact, Swinburne also replied with a pamphlet called Under the Microscope in 1872. In NET exam, this is asked in detail. રોઝોટી જે છે એમનું ધ સ્ટેલ્થી સ્કૂલ ઓફ ક્રિટિઝમ એ કોના વર્કના જવાબમાં લખાયું તો રોબર્ટ પુચાનન. ટાઇટલ હતું ધ સ્પ્લેસી સ્કૂલ ઓફ પોએટ્રી. યુ વિલ નો જે છે પર્ટિક્યુલરલી સેક્સ્યુઆલિટીની જે થીમ છે એમ થોડા પેઇન્ટિંગ્સ તમે જોશો એટલે એક આઈડિયા આવી જશે. લેટ અસ સી some particularly the paintings of this group called PRP. This is Christ in the house of his parent, one of the famous painting of this movement. PRB જીસસ ક્રાઇસ્ટ જે છે એમની ફેમિલી સાથે જે છે એ તમે ફોટો જોઈ શકો છો. ધીસ ઇઝ વન ઓફ ધી ફેમસ પિક્ચર ઓફ ઓફેલિયા. જે તમે આપણે હેમલેટ છે એ વખતે ઓફેલિયા ઇઝ ડાયડ બિકોઝ ઓફ ડ્રાઉનિંગ અને એ જે છે એ પીઆરબી મુવમેન્ટ દ્વારા પિક્ચરાઇઝ કરવામાં આવ્યું છે. Then you have Mariana, એક પેઇન્ટિંગ છે, અગેન ફેમસ પેઇન્ટિંગ. તો આ જે છે એના સિવાય અમુક જે છે માઇકલ એન્જેલો અને તમે કહી શકો કે રાફેલના જે છે વર્ક, જેમાં એક ફ્રેન્ક ટ્રીટમેન્ટ છે સેક્સ્યુઆલિટીની. તો એના કારણે જે છે તમારી જોડે બુચાનન જે છે એને એસે લખવો પડે, રોબર્ટ બુચાનનને, ધ ફ્લેશી સ્કૂલ ઓફ પોએટ્રી. Then let us talk about the important name of this movement. ડીજી રોસોટી જે છે પેઇન્ટિંગમાં ઇન્ટરેસ્ટેડ હતા એન્ડ ધીસ ઇઝ ધ પિક્ચર ઓફ ડીજી રોસોટી. દેન તમારી જોડે જે છે કહી શકાય કે હી વોઝ ધ લીડર. એન્ડ another important name of this movement is William Holman Hunt, John Everest Melius. પછી જે છે તમારી જોડે એમના મેજર વર્ક્સ છે એમાં દાંતે એટ વેરોના, ધ બ્રાઇડ્સ પ્રેલ્યુડ એન્ડ સિસ્ટર હેલન. આ ત્રણ વર્ક છે ઇમ્પોર્ટન્ટ છે. દાંતે એટ વેરોના, ધ બ્રાઇડ્સ પ્રેલ્યુડ એન્ડ સિસ્ટર હેલેના. જસ્ટ રિમેમ્બર ધી ટાઇટલ્સ. રોઝોટી જે છે એમણે પર્ટિક્યુલરલી એક જે છે મિલિયસ અને હોલમેન હન્ટ જે છે એમને પર્ટિક્યુલરલી જે છે વધારે ફોકસ કર્યું છે પેઇન્ટિંગમાં ટેનિસનની પોયમ્સ ઉપર. બરાબર. પછી તમારી જોડે જે છે એક વર્ક છે બ્લેસ ડેમોઝલ. ધીસ ઇઝ અ પોયમ જે છે રિટન બાય ડીજી રોસોટી. જસ્ટ રિમેમ્બર ધી ટાઇટલ. થોડા પેઇન્ટિંગ્સ છે ડીજી રોસોટીના અલગ અલગ તમે જોઈ શકો છો. ધ ફોકસ ઇઝ ઓન પર્ટિક્યુલરલી જે છે પેરાડાઇઝ લોસ છે એના જે છે થોડા પિક્ચર્સ છે. As I've told you, you don't have to go into detail in this work called the Blaze Damozel. Just remember the title because they are famous for their paintings, not for their poems. Then you have Oxford murals that is commissioned by John Ruskin. And you have the Arthurian themes in this work where you have the mention of King Arthur. Then you have two stunners, just title is important. Then later on he wrote some collection of poems. One is collection which is entitled Poems Itself, that is published in 1837. Then the early Italian poets, which was particularly focused on Dante, which was published in 1861. And then you have some translation added and you have revised edition, that is 1874. Then in the last year, you can say that he wrote the reply of the Placid School of Poetry with the title called the Stealthy School of Criticism. And one of the thing is that he published a collection of ballads and sonnets. અને આ જે છે સોનેટ સિક્વન્સમાં એક સોનેટ છે ધ હાઉસ ઓફ લાઈફ દેટ ઇઝ ઇમ્પોર્ટન્ટ title is important, and this collection ballads and sonnet that was published in 1881, that is publication year is important. Okay. જે છે પાછળના વર્ષે એમને સુસાઇડ કરવાનો પ્રયત્ન કર્યો હતો બીકોઝ ઓફ સમ પ્રોબ્લેમ્સ જે છે બીમારીના કારણે જે છે he was facing so many pain in his life, that is why he attempted suicide. પછી તમારી જોડે જે છે આગળના વર્કમાં જે છે બીજા પોએટ છે જેનું શોર્ટમાં નેમ છે એસી સ્વિનબર્ગ, જેનું પૂરું નામ છે એલ્ગરન ચાર્લ્સ સ્વિનબર્ગ. લાઈફ સ્પેન 1837 to 1909. એન્ડ ઇનફેક્ટ જે છે આ જે ગ્રુપમાં છે વન ઓફ ધી નોટેરિયસ રાઇટર આલ્કોહોલિક જે એડિક્ટેડ હતા, અને શરૂઆતમાં જે છે એમને અમુક પોએમ્સના કલેક્શન લખ્યા છે. ધીસ ઇઝ અ પિક્ચર ઓફ એસી સ્પિનબર્ગ. તમારી જોડે જે છે હી વોઝ હોમોસેક્સ્યુઅલ, અને એક આ રાઇટર અને બીજું છે ઓસ્કાર વાઇલ્ડ. આ બંને રાઇટર જે છે એમના કારણે શું છે કે ધીસ મુવમેન્ટ વોઝ શોર્ટ લીવ્ડ બીકોઝ દે વર ફાઉન્ડ ઓન ધી ગ્રાઉન્ડ ઓફ મોરાલિટી. દે ફાઉન્ડ ગિલ્ટી ઓન ધી ગ્રાઉન્ડ ઓફ મોરાલિટી. ઓસ્કાર વાઇલ્ડ પણ હોમોસેક્સ્યુઅલ હતા, અને આના કારણે જે છે આર્ટ ફોર આર્ટ સેક અને પીઆરબી મુવમેન્ટ બંને જે છે એ શોર્ટ ટર્મ માટે જ ચાલુ રહી અને પૂરી થઈ ગઈ ટૂંક સમયમાં જ. વિલિયમ મોરિસ જે છે એક રાઇટર જે છે તમારી જોડે, એમનું એક વર્ક છે લાઈફ એન્ડ ડેથ ઓફ જેસન, અને બીજું એક જે છે ટાઇટલ જે ફેમસ છે જે તમને પૂછાયેલું છે ન્યૂઝ ફ્રોમ નોવેર, that is a utopian fiction, utopian and science fiction. Remember the year 1890 because this is asked in the exam. Another title that is the wood beyond the world, the well at the world's end. But the important title is news from nowhere, that is asked in the exam. This is a picture of William Morris. એમના થોડા પેઇન્ટિંગ્સ છે, યુ કેન સી જે છે નજીકથી તમે જોશો તો ધીસ આર ધી ગ્રેટ વર્ક્સ વિલિયમ મોરિસના જે છે પેઇન્ટિંગ, કારણ કે એકદમ બારીકાઈથી જે છે બહુ કામ કરેલું છે. યુ કેન ફાઇન્ડ ઓલ ધીસ વર્ક ઇન બ્રિટિશ મ્યુઝિયમ. આ બધા પેઇન્ટિંગ્સ છે તમે જોઈ શકો છો. ઇવન ઇફ યુ સર્ચ ઓન ગૂગલ દેન યુ વિલ ફાઇન્ડ the paintings of William Morris, A.C. Swinburne, D.G. Rossotti, C.G. Rossotti, બધાના જે છે પેઇન્ટિંગ તમને મળી રહેશે. રિમેમ્બર વન રાઇટર દેટ ઇઝ એડવર્ડ ફિઝગેરાલ્ડ. હવે ફિઝગેરાલ્ડ છે એ અમેરિકન રાઇટર પણ એક છે, એનું નામ છે, બટ ધીસ ઇઝ અ બ્રિટિશ રાઇટર. ડોન્ટ કન્ફ્યુઝ ઇન ધ નેમ. બટ બંનેના જે છે એડવર્ડ ફિઝગેરાલ્ડ તમારે અમેરિકન લિટરેચરમાં પણ આવશે અને ઇંગ્લિશ લિટરેચરમાં પણ આ નેમ છે. ધી બ્રિટિશ રાઇટર્સ લાઈફ પેન ઇઝ 1809 to 1883, and in fact he is famous for the translation of Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. ઓમર ખ્યામ જે છે એમની પર્શિયન પોએટ છે, એમનું એક વર્ક છે રૂબેયત, અને એ જે છે એને ઇંગ્લિશમાં ટ્રાન્સલેટ કરવાનું કામ કર્યું છે એડવર્ડ ફિઝગેરાલ્ડે. તમને આ પ્રશ્ન જે છે પૂછાઈ ચૂકેલો છે. હુ ટ્રાન્સલેટેડ ધી some of the you can say verses of Rubaiyat that is written by Omar Khayyam in English literature. That is a Victorian British poet Edward Fitzgerald. કારણ કે શરૂઆતમાં તમારી જોડે અમેરિકન લિટરેચર છે તો એમાં પણ જે પીરિયડના નામ આપેલા છે રોમેન્ટિક એજ, વિક્ટોરિયન એજ, એ ઇંગ્લિશના જે છે એ જ નામ આપવામાં આવ્યા છે. ઇવન યુ વિલ ફાઇન્ડ મોડર્ન એજ, પોસ્ટ મોડર્ન એજ ઇન અમેરિકન લિટરેચર. એમાં કોઈ મુમેન્ટ અથવા તો કોઈ પોએટના આધારે અમેરિકન લિટરેચરમાં અલગથી નામ નથી આપવામાં આવ્યા. બ્રિટિશ લિટરેચર જે છે એ જ મોડલ પર એ જે છે એ જ ઓળખાય છે. તો ડોન્ટ કન્ફ્યુઝ વિથ ધ નેમ. બીજું છે તમારી જોડે અહીંયા જે છે ફેમસ લાઈન છે રૂબિયત એ આપી છે, ધ મૂવિંગ ફિંગર રાઇટ્સ એન્ડ હેવિંગ રીટ moves on, nor all UPT nor wit shall you it back to cancel half a line, nor your tears wash out a word of it. This is a famous line of this translation. Remember this. બીજું છે કે તમારી જોડે જે છે ધીસ ઇઝ રિટન ઇન અ ક્વોટ્રેન, એટલે કે 4 લાઈન છે એનું તમને દરેક સ્ટાન્જા જોવા મળે છે. આ જે છે એનું ઇન્ફ્લુઅન્સ છે રબીબેન એઝરામાં તમને જોવા મળે છે, રોબર્ટ બ્રાઉનિંગમાં. બરાબર. એક પિક્ચર જે છે તમને આ પર્ટિક્યુલરલી આપ્યું છે, દેટ ઇઝ રૂબેયતનું છે. બરાબર. વન ઓફ ધ ઇમ્પોર્ટન્ટ વર્ક ઇન ધી કલેક્શન ઓફ અ પર્શિયન રાઇટિંગ, આ જે છે વર્ક ફેમસ છે. So this is all about some important works of this period. We have only talked about the poets. We have to deal with the drama, and in fact one of the prominent genre of this period is prose. So we will discuss some of the important writers who have contributed in the field of prose, like Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, William Makepeace Thackeray, George Eliot in the next lecture. I hope you have understood whatever we have discussed in this class, today's class. We will meet tomorrow, and we will discuss the Victorian poets. If you have any, sorry, Victorian prose writers. And if you have any question, then you can ask me. I hope you are doing well after the, you can say, the Navratri. Your focus would be on the exam. Now, hardly you have 1 month and 10 days. So, this is a period where you should focus on Victorian literature, romantic literature, then modern, postmodern. Try to complete the syllabus, and of course, do not forget paper 1. Paper 1 is also important because there is particularly જે છે ઇમ્પોર્ટન્સ છે ઇન ધીસ ન્યૂ પેટર્ન કે તમારી જોડે બંનેના માર્ક્સ છે કમ્બાઈન ગણવામાં આવે છે. Earlier you have to qualify the paper 1 and focus is on paper 2, but that is not a case now. So you have to treat paper 1 as you are treating paper 2. Of course, that is a subject paper, so you will be familiar with your paper 2, but paper 1 you have some units like data interpretation, logic, mathematics, and you have some reasoning questions. So try to practice those questions, and try to solve the PYQ, previous year questions, in a paper 1 particularly. અને જીસેટના જે છે એની સામે નેટના પેપર જે છે જૂના એ પણ પેપર 1માં સોલ્વ કરો તો એ તમને ફાયદો રહેશે. We will meet tomorrow. I think I will send the timing of tomorrow જે છે એ એડવાન્સમાં જણાવી દઈશ, અને પોસિબલ હશે તો પછી આપણે જો દિવસે નહીં પોસિબલ થાય તો we will meet at the night. Okay, so thank you. We will meet tomorrow.